Would you spend Christmas alone even if you owned the tallest building in the city? The question hung in the air of a penthouse that gleamed like a trophy, where lights from below looked like a different life. Jonathan Hale had wealth, a reputation, and a silence that sounded like glass on glass. Until an invitation arrived that he had not anticipated. An invitation from someone whose hands smelled of flour and soap. Before we begin, tell us in the comments what city you are watching from, and at the end, give this story a score from 0 to 10. Stay through to the end and decide if this is a story about regret, hope, or both. If you like stories about real change, subscribe and hit the bell to see more. Jonathan had been a presence that everyone recognized, but few claimed. He had a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected his fortune back at him. The living room held art that cost more than most houses, a piano played on command, and a wine cellar that had its own lighting system. He arrived home at odd hours, his suits always impeccable, his voice rarely rising above polite distance. On the night the invitation changed everything, the heating hummed softly, the air smelled faintly of cedar, and the city noise was muffled into a distant hum. He had lived on top of the world and learned to measure success in numbers and in controlled silence. Then the buzzer on his private elevator rang, and a different kind of noise entered his life. The invitation was 3 words, spoken simply at the door, by a woman with a broom and flower on her sleeve. "Come to dinner." She smiled like it was a fact and not a favor. Jonathan hesitated because everyone around him assumed he would refuse. He was the kind of man who attended charity galas and spoke politely at ribbon cuttings at City Hall, but who rarely accepted genuine offers, because a genuine offer implied vulnerability. The woman had a name tag on a faded apron that read Clara. It was the sort of name that felt human in a building where names were often titles. He left the penthouse for the first time in a while to go down to a neighborhood that smelled of cod, coffee, homemade, and warm bread. At the small apartment where Clara lived above a grocery, the world was different. The walls were painted with hand-me-down colors, pots simmered with codfish and tomatoes, and there was a radio playing an old song that kept time with the chop of a knife. Around the table sat Rosa, a seamstress who fixed dresses for the local theater, Luis Mercado, who sold vegetables 2 blocks away, Anna, who was Clara's sister and an elementary school teacher, Tomas Rivera, the accountant who balanced his books by hand and loved to argue over the bill, and Mrs. Alvarez, who ran the Pornage Bakery and made the best brigadeiro anyone had tasted. The air filled with the smell of coffee, with brigadeiros cooling on a plate, with laughter that bounced like warm light off the modest ceiling. Clara moved like she belonged to the room, quick hands wiping flour from her apron, fingers that had learned to mend shirts and mend hearts too. "Are you sure?" Jonathan asked the first time, trying to sound casual while feeling out of place on a wooden chair worn by a dozen people he barely knew. "Yes," Clara said, and the simplicity of that yes unsettled him. "We do not have much, but there is room. Sit." "Do you want me to leave my coat?" he asked, because rituals made him feel safe. "Keep it if you wish," Rosa said, and smiled in a way that made him feel less like an exhibit. They spoke then in small exchanges that spiraled into a conversation that neither had planned. Jonathan spoke of numbers and meetings and a contract that had just been signed that week. Clara spoke of the little cafe she dreamed of opening, of a place where she would make coffee homemade and serve codfish stew on Sundays, of a menu that included brigadeiro and savory pies, of a seamstress who would hang handmade curtains, and of a community that already felt like family. Each sentence invited a new sense of belonging into the penthouse man. Sensory details kept arriving like small gifts. He tasted the bitterness of black coffee cut with brown sugar that stuck slightly to the roof of his mouth. He felt the uneven grain of the wooden table against his palm. He smelled the sweet chocolate of the brigadeiro and the salt of simmering cod. He heard the radio scratch a familiar song that had no place in his marble world. He saw the way the candlelight trembled against a photo of a child that Anna kept on a shelf. Conversation lengthened into comfort. The dinner scene became a centerpiece of exchange with 10 precise turns of dialogue that unfurled intimacy and curiosity. Jonathan asked, then listened, then asked again. Clara replied with stories of small victories and losses. Rosa criticized Jonathan gently for his stiff manners. Luis made a joke about the city, and Jonathan laughed in a way that surprised him. Tomas debated taxes and discounts. Mrs. Alvarez offered him a second piece of brigadeiro. Ana asked where he had learned to be so careful with words. The lines kept weaving and building until everyone had spoken, and the room felt full. At least 5 of them touched Jonathan like a slow tide, naming his loneliness without naming his wealth, offering him a seat where his success could be understood in different terms than balance sheets. That night he left with the taste of cod on his lips and the sound of laughter in his ears. The elevator ride back up was long, the glass showing a grid of lights like stars misplaced. He had made no promises, and yet he felt his coat lighter when he stepped into the penthouse. The next morning, he found himself thinking about a small cafe with a yellow awning more than he thought a man in his position should. He had never considered he wanted a place to come late and not feel like an intruder. Jonathan's past was not a mystery. It was a collection of careful choices that had closed doors even as they opened windows. He had been the son of a regional manager who taught him early the exactness of accounting ledgers, and a mother who believed that appearances were a form of currency. He grew up in a house that smelled of polished wood and lemon oil, where birthdays were scheduled between business dinners, where affection was measured in lessons about investments. At university, he worked 2 jobs cleaning labs and later built a startup that thrived on his willingness to make cold choices. He had been married once to a woman named Eleanor, whose laugh had been precise, whose patience had matched her wardrobe, and their divorce had been public in a way that had taught Jonathan to guard both his heart and his image. Loss had been procedural to him, filed and archived, a line item in a private ledger. Grief had been something he had read about in case studies. He had given large donations to the city hospital and the Arts Trust because giving felt like a clean transaction rather than a messy relationship. The tragedy that altered his life happened slowly, in a series of small things. His father died without a word of reconciliation. He learned that wealth could settle coldly into furniture. He learned that solitude could be engineered, but not always controlled. The scar that mattered most to him was not visible on skin, but on the soft places others never saw. It made him precise, careful, present in boardrooms and absent at dinner tables. Clara's history belonged to hands and flavors. She had learned to sew before she could write, following her grandmother's fingers as they taught her to patch more than clothing. Her childhood had been a small apartment near the market where the smell of codfish mingled with fresh cilantro and the shouts of vendors. Her father had been a fisherman who loved maps and taught her the names of fish and the best times to buy them. Her mother had stitched dresses for weddings and for funerals and always had something sweet in the kitchen. School had offered her a way out, but also anchored her to community. She worked as a cleaner in the office blocks during the afternoons and learned the shortcuts of doors and the kindness of leaving a note for someone who looked tired. She had wanted to open a cafe for years, a place that served coffee homemade the way her mother had taught her, where the menu would include cod, stew on Sundays, and small treats like brigadeiro and sweet empanadas. The cost of dreams had often outpaced her savings, and yet she kept a jar labeled "Small Steps" on the shelf. When she invited Jonathan to dinner, it was because she believed that food could be a bridge. Her loss had been quieter. A brother had left town for a different life and kept no promises. A lover had chosen stability over chance and left her with a collection of unfinished patterns. She nurtured hope in small ways, in stitches and in leftover spice jars. This hope had become a quiet, stubborn force in her chest. The early weeks after the dinner were gentle and disruptive all at once. Jonathan found reasons to pass the grocery that sold fresh cod, to peek at the cafe space Clara dreamed of, to offer small sums under the guise of philanthropy. People noticed. Marcus Reed noticed first. He was a CEO of a rival firm, a man with a public smile and the kind of wealth that measured prominence in press coverage. Marcus had been Jonathan's college contemporary and had long resented Jonathan's quieter ascendancy. He moved in circles that expected public displays and used gossip like collateral. When Marcus learned of Jonathan's visits to a modest apartment and his acceptance of a dinner invitation, he saw opportunity and threat at once. He began to whisper. He began to gather a small chorus in the corporate lunchroom. He planted a seed that would grow into a public scene, because power often protected itself with spectacle. The first major humiliation came at a community awards event where Jonathan had gone to present a grant. Marcus had arranged for a local columnist to attend and for several board members from Jonathan's foundation to be there. He intended to paint the visits as a staged PR move. In the moment, everything shifted. A photograph captured Jonathan laughing with children as he tasted a cod fritter. A caption insinuated that he was seeking publicity and that Clara was a prop. The sting of accusation landed in a place Jonathan did not expect. He had always been careful of optics, and now the optics had betrayed him. The audio from a brief exchange was clipped and circulated with context removed. People in Jonathan's social orbit started to withdraw politely. Friends called with cautious distance. Trustees sent formal emails that sounded like condolences for a reputation rather than concern for a person. Clara felt the reverberation first at home. Her neighbors saw the headlines and assumed she had been used, that she had traded hospitality for something else. The seamstress Rosa and the market vendor Luis argued in the street about loyalty and shame. Tomas the accountant asked Jonathan to explain himself in detail and left with too many questions. The humiliation was public, and it landed with a weight that separated them as surely as a locked door. Jonathan, who had never been good at public apologies, retreated into the only thing he knew how to manage, his calendar. That scene of public humiliation had a slow burn. It was a moment of 550 words that felt compressed into a smaller time with 600 characters of raw tension. Jonathan stood in the lobby of his office building and watched a flash of cameras. The air tasted metallic. He felt the weight of eyes that interpreted kindness as weakness. Clara heard the rumors before she read them because Mrs. Alvarez called to warn her. The community's voice split between fury and protectiveness. Some defended Clara and accused Jonathan's world of cruelty. Others suggested she was a pawn. For Jonathan, the real punishment was not the headlines, but the absence that followed from those he trusted. The silence at the penthouse became a deeper thing. After the humiliation, attempts at reconciliation multiplied and failed in ways that exposed both stubbornness and fear. Jonathan sent messages that read like offers instead of apologies. He called Anastasia, his public relations manager, and she drafted statements that sanitized emotion into phrases that suited donors. He asked Tomas to handle conversations with the board so that he could step back. Clara read the statements and saw formality where she had hoped for honesty. The neighborhood rallied in small ways, the bakeress delivering a tray of brigadeiros and the seamstress dropping off curtains sewn from cloth she had mended by hand. But the wedge between them grew. Jonathan began to think that reconciliation required strategy, paperwork, and legal counsel because his life taught him to manage consequences with contracts. He met with his lawyer, a smart woman named Elena, who suggested they prepare a detailed statement and evidence of his visits that demonstrated no ulterior motive. He tasked Tomas to prepare financial summaries that showed he had no hidden motivations for investing in Clara's future. The legal and public relations machinery hummed, efficient and cold. In 300 characters, the procedural description read like this. The team gathered receipts, timestamps, and webcam footage, collated meetings with timestamps, notarized testimony from neighbors, and prepared a timeline to refute narrative claims. The mechanics of proof felt clinical and failed to touch the human part that wanted to sit and say sorry without conditions. At the same time, Clara experienced isolation. Some neighbors feared association. Others clutched at their loyalty. Anna urged caution and suggested she keep a distance for a while. Linda, a volunteer at the union where Clara helped with soup kitchens, advised her to be careful with her heart. Clara felt squeezed between community defense and the public's cruel misinterpretation. Jonathan tried to bridge the gap with gifts. He arranged for fresh cod delivery to the grocery, bought new sewing machines for Rosa, offered a contract to Tomas to handle a pro bono audit of the cafe idea. Each gesture was meant as support, but landed sometimes as compensation, as if money could buy back trust. They spoke less and wrote more. Jonathan's phone like unread apologies. The turning point came at the neighborhood winter fair, where the streets were strung with lights and the scent of fried dough filled the air. The festival had been organized by Councilman Perez and a coalition of small business owners to boost the local economy. Clara agreed to help set up a booth for a cause she believed in, where she served cod fritters and offered free coffee homemade to anyone who needed warmth. Jonathan arrived quietly, not as a spectacle, but as someone who understood he would not control perception. He came alone, wearing a scarf he had bought because the wind had a way of making him feel exposed. The reunion at the fair was public and informal. It began with a conversation that stretched through 10 careful exchanges. Jonathan approached easily and awkwardly. "I did not mean for you to be exposed," he said. "I know," Clara replied, and she kept her voice steady. "But you must know what exposure costs here." "I never wanted to cost you anything," he said. "I know," she said again, "but your world slings labels like stones." "I am learning how heavy those stones are," he admitted. "Then learn in a way that does not hurt other people," she told him. "I will try," he said. "I still do not know how to say sorry without it sounding like a press release." "Then do not say it in press release language," she said and smiled, a small defiant smile. "Say it in coffee and a stool between 2 tables." "Your coffee is better than any apology," he said, and there was laughter from a few neighbors who watched, including Mrs. Alvarez and Luis, who cheered quietly. "Would you let me sweep the floor?" "No," she said, playfully stern, "but you may wash the cups." The conversation moved from guarded to collaborative. They argued about the right amount of sugar in the brigadeiro and how much cod should be in a fritter. Rosa taught Jonathan how to roll pastry dough with a steady hand. Thomas stopped by with a pad of paper and offered to help register the cafe with the city. Anna stood nearby and adjusted a string of lights, smiling as if this small act could stitch what headlines had torn. The fair scene included at least 5 sensory details that made the moment vivid. The heat from the grill hit his face like a practical thing he could understand. The sound of children's laughter threaded through the music like a melody. The smell of frying cod and cinnamon joined the warm sugar of fresh brigadeiros on a plate. The feel of sticky sugar on his thumb surprised him. The sight of Clara moving easily between people made him feel like an intruder who had been granted an invitation. And the scene included several named supporters who intervened quietly. Councilman Perez offered a small speech about community and charity. Mrs. Alvarez declared that if Clara needed a place to test recipes, she could use the bakery oven on Tuesdays. Louis offered to advertise the new cafe at his stall. Tomas and Rosa volunteered bookkeeping help and curtains, respectively. The voices around them created a scaffolding for reconciliation more substantial than any corporate apology. After the fair, they agreed to try slowly, privately. He would fund a renovation, not as a publicity stunt, but as a loan with reasonable terms and no expectation of control. She accepted cautiously. Marcus noticed their repair and redoubled efforts to discredit Jonathan at work, whispering that his attention to the neighborhood was a liability. The boardroom learned of the rumors and began to murmur about fiduciary risk. Jonathan prepared to face his critics not as a man who would buy silence, but as a man who would reveal a truth. The confrontation took place in a high-rise boardroom with glass walls where the city glittered below. Marcus arranged an emergency meeting under the guise of a quarterly review. He presented altered documents and suggested that funds had been diverted, that a contract had been improperly influenced. He had crafted a narrative that looked plausible to anyone reading quickly. Jonathan chose not to answer with lawyers first. He stood and asked for the floor and then for a moment of listening. The room smelled of stale coffee and expensive cologne. The tension built like a swell of thunder. Jonathan spoke clearly and provided a presentation that had been prepared quietly with help from Tomas, Elena his lawyer, and an independent auditor named Claire. The factual exposition included a technical description of the forensic audit in plain language. It explained that the finance team had traced transfers using bank trace codes, verified timestamps against security footage, cross-referenced vendor receipts, and notarized witness statements. The report had metadata that proved authenticity. The explanation was concise, 300 characters that made complexity accessible. The audit pinned each transfer to a vendor account, matched timestamps to security video, obtained sworn testimony, and produced a clear ledger of intent and use. The board listened because the evidence was tidy and because facts in that room mattered more than gossip. Marcus attempted to interrupt. He had rehearsed jabs and insinuations. The tension flared into a longer confrontation that lasted several heated exchanges, about 550 characters of raw engagement where the room felt like a courtroom. "This is theater," Marcus argued, a smile too bright. "Are we to believe this is altruism?" "You are to believe the evidence," Jonathan replied, and his voice did not waver. "This is not theater. These are receipts and accounts that show the transfers were loans repaid to the corporation as agreed and documented." Tomas stood and offered technical clarification. Elena read a clause aloud and pointed to a signed contract that established clear oversight. Claire, the auditor, presented a timeline of events. Faces in the room hardened, then softened as the momentum shifted. Marcus's whispers found less purchase as the board saw that his claims relied on insinuation rather than documentation. The meeting closed with a motion to refer the matter to the Ethics Committee and to commission a further independent review. Marcus's position weakened. He had gambled on rumor and had not accounted for evidence. The victory felt public and intimate at once. It was not theatrical revenge, but an administrative clearance that restored Jonathan's ability to move in both worlds without those old accusations as shackles. Marcus was reprimanded and made to step down from a committee, and some contracts were reviewed for conflict of interest. Journalists filed pieces about the ethics inquiry and about the complexity of power. Clara watched the reporting and felt relief more than triumph. She had not wanted his vindication for the sake of headlines, but because the rumor had hurt her community. The final arc was about transformation and the realization of a small dream that slowly became a real thing. Jonathan funded the renovation of a tiny space on the corner of the Market Street where Clara had long imagined a cafe. The contract that many had feared became a loan with flexible repayment terms arranged by Tomas and overseen by Elena to ensure fairness. Rosa sewed curtains that matched Mrs. Alvarez's bunting. Luis advertised the grand opening, and Councilman Perez attended with a ribbon he presented ceremonially but with sincere pride. The cafe opened with a modest sign painted by Anna. The menu included cod stew on Sundays, coffee homemade, small plates of cod fritters, and sweet brigadeiros printed as brigadeiros on the menu board as a cheeky nod to tradition. The place smelled of roasted beans and hot sugar and the hum of conversation. The opening day had at least 10 exchanges between Clara and Jonathan that were warm and candid. He learned to take orders without consulting an advisor. She learned to accept help without feeling diminished. The community filled the tables, and the neighborhood felt like a chorus that had rewritten itself. There were smaller tensions on the way. Marcus did not concede quietly. He attempted a final gambit at the investor meeting, circulating a letter that questioned governance. The letter was rebuffed because Jonathan had put in the procedural work to create transparency. The legal processes were explained in accessible terms. Elena prepared a memo that clarified oversight responsibilities, how the repayment plan was structured, and how community stakeholders would be consulted in operations. The memo was technical but readable and prevented future confusion. The community, in turn, rewarded honesty, and the cafe thrived slowly and genuinely. A month later, Clara reflected on the way life had shifted. She had an early morning routine that began with counting pastry trays and ended with a receipt book that still gave her a small thrill. The neighborhood visited more often and had a place to gather. She had a small staff that included Rosa as an official seamstress of curtains and Anna as a part-time manager. Mrs. Alvarez supplied pastries on Tuesdays, and Louis posted a sign that read, "Support local small business." Jonathan visited not as a spectacle, but as a regular who sometimes washed dishes and sometimes offered advice about inventory that Anna appreciated. They celebrated small things: a tax break that Tomas had negotiated, a positive review in a local paper, children doing homework at the corner table while their mothers talked. The cafe was not only a business, but an anchor. Clara kept a jar labeled "Small Steps" on a shelf, and it now held more than coins. She had been cautious about a proposal because trust, once bruised, takes time to heal. The first month was about rhythms more than proclamations. 3 months later, the transformation had deepened. The cafe became a point of connection for social projects. A local initiative that began with Councilman Perez offered discounts for community volunteers. Jonathan funded a small scholarship for vocational training in culinary arts overseen by the union and run partly through the cafe. Tomas helped establish a simple accounting class offered on weekends. The board of the foundation that had once been skeptical began to visit the neighborhood, not as donors, but as learners. Marcus had faded from center stage as the community claimed its narrative. Clara and Jonathan had conversations about the future without pressure. They spoke about a partnership that was not a romantic proposal, but a strategic and emotional collaboration. Jonathan would provide mentorship and seed funding, and Clara would continue to run the cafe and its community initiatives. There were small public signs of healing. The fair returned, brighter than before, and the sound of laughter felt less fragile. 6 months later, the scene had a different cadence. The cafe had expanded by converting the back room into a tiny classroom for workshops in sewing and baking. Rosa taught sewing lessons to teenagers after school. Anna had started a reading hour that brought parents in. The neighborhood reported a small increase in foot traffic to other businesses. Mrs. Alvarez opened a second counter. Louis hired an apprentice and proudly announced that he had never had more repeat customers. Jonathan had become a familiar and gentle presence, still precise in business but less austere in manner. He sat by the window sometimes and read a book, sipping coffee homemade, and allowed himself to be called by his first name without flinching. He attended a small gathering at the cafe where he told a story about learning to roll pastry and how the sticky sugar on his thumb had reminded him he could be messy and still be present. Clara and he stood by a window and watched the street. He did not kneel in an elaborate proposal. Instead, he asked quite plainly if they could continue to build something together, personal and public, without the need for grand statements. She said yes. The proposal had been a conversation more than a spectacle, and it landed like a soft promise that two people could be better in company than apart. If this story so far has stirred something in you, tell us in the comments what city you are watching from and give this narrative a score from 0 to 10. If you have ever felt that success and loneliness were linked, share that with us so others can see themselves in your words. Your comments help build a community where different perspectives meet and where stories can shift the next chapter for someone else. By leaving a short city name and a number, you help others see that they are not alone in wondering whether material safety equals emotional safety. Thank you for sharing. Now we return to the last parts of this story. The resolution kept its modesty. The ethics committee had cleared Jonathan and the local media moved on to the next sensational item. The real consequence was quieter and richer, a neighborhood reclaiming its dignity. Several neighbors became important allies in different ways. Rosa became the cafe curtain maker and occasional manager of the sewing classes. Tomas helped with bookkeeping and made sure the loan terms were fair. Mrs. Alvarez made the official opening cake and taught Clara how to make a better brigadeiro. Luis organized a market corner where the cafe could display fresh pastry. Councilman Perez offered to link the cafe to a municipal program that advertised small businesses. Elena, the lawyer, continued to advise with a human touch that respected community values. The list of named supporters included at least these 5 to 8 people who became a living network of support and work. There were lessons learned. Jonathan learned that money without listening can sound like force. Clara learned that acceptance of help did not mean loss of agency. The community learned that dignity could be defended and that gossip can be countered by neighbors who speak up. The seamstress sewing curtains learned that a small act of craftsmanship could become a lasting symbol of home. The closing scenes were full of ordinary moments that mattered. A child spilled sugar on a chair, and Clara laughed because she used to spill sugar as a child. Jonathan wiped the table and found himself humming a song he thought he had forgotten. The cafe's menu card listed cod stew as a weekend special and brigadeiros as brigadelles in playful print. People came to sit, to read, to share, to argue about the right amount of salt. The final sentence that lingered as they closed the doors for the night was simple and true. Home is not a place you buy, but a table where people decide to stay. If this story warmed you, subscribe to see more narratives where kindness and accountability change lives. If you enjoy investigations into how communities heal, hit subscribe and ring the bell. Share this video with someone who believes in second chances, and tell us in the comments where you watched from and what score you give this transformation. Thank you. You for staying to the end and for being part of a community that values small actions that become big changes. Home was not the penthouse, and it was not only the cafe. Home was the people who chose to keep company at the table.